Hello, everyone, and welcome to the conference. We're really happy to have you here this morning. So my name is Matt Cardoso. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and I'm the student lead for the Beating the Shift Baseball Analytics panel. And with us today, we have a very distinguished panel, plenty of brilliant minds from baseball. So we've got Sandy Alderson from the New York Mets.
Happy to be here.
Ben Lindbergh from Grantland. Dan Brooks from brooksbaseball.net. Dave Cameron from Fangraphs. And we'll be moderated today by Jonah Carey from ESPN. So we'll have the discussion go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And you can ask questions or vote on the actual questions via the conference panel app. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jonah.
Thanks. So first of all, I have to do this. This comes out on Tuesday. It's called Up, and Away. It's a great book about the Montreal Expos, and you should read it. Now we'll continue. So yeah, there you go. So the first question is probably the most burning question in the entire field of analytics. And it's to Sandy. Why do you hate shortstop so much?
Well, you know, we've spent a lot of time looking at shortstops over the last few months, and actually, analytics have played a fair role in our canvassing of possibilities. And you know, we have a candidate now, somebody who will very likely be our starting shortstop, and there's not a lot of defensive data that we can point to that gives us great comfort, but what there is, and it may be a small sample, suggests to us that compared to what alternatives we had, he'll be fine. So, you know, we've used analytics over the last several years to make choices among players, and you know, generally it's been it's given us, I think, sort of an insight. Not that we've made every decision has been the right one, but certainly we've used the information as best we could.
I'm actually going to shift we were talking earlier about the questions, but since we started on this, I actually want to get to something related. And you and I talked about this. We can start with you. Yoán Moncada signed a $30 million deal, which triggered a $60 million tax, which the Red Sox have to pay immediately in the next month. And Brian Sabean, the general manager of the Giants, was saying on the record that he wasn't going to consider it because they have a set payroll and they can't just jump up that way. And I thought this was interesting. We're chatting about it, that the notion of, not so much about Moncada specifically, but about how you run a payroll. Do you want to do it where you have a rolling average? And JP Ricciardi used to do it with the Blue Jays that way. But most teams, because of the stability, ownership wants stability, says, let's just keep it at this level. So what are your thoughts on that? If a guy like Moncada becomes available, is it feasible for teams to say, yeah, we're blowing up the way we're doing our finances, here's a $60 million check? Or could a team defy that and potentially have a competitive advantage by saying, we're going to run our finances a little differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those interesting cases, right, where obviously Sandy knows this far better than we do, and we're speculating as outsiders, but it seems like the fixed year budget that's $90 million every year, $110 million every year, $150 million every year, when you're either winning or contending or rebuilding, doesn't make a ton of sense. Like from the Phillies' perspective, they're probably not going to be very good this year, but they still have a really high payroll, and they refuse to throw in cash in order to kind of buy better prospects. It might make more sense for them to go $50 million this year and then $240 million next year rather than $150 when they're not winning. And so reallocating the same amount of money, but just spending more when you're winning and less when you're losing, seems to be a rational economic decision. But from an ownership perspective, if they're running on a cash flow basis and they're trying to tie their expenses to their revenues, it doesn't work that way, right? Because you're not going to have your season tickets go from 20,000 to 1,000. They don't follow the same way. Your TV deal is all going to be spread out over the life of the contract ahead of time. So if you're tying your cash flows to your revenues and your expenses to your revenues, it's probably difficult for an owner to make that grasp and say, unless you're the Yankees or the Dodgers, the Red Sox, the teams that were bidding on this guy, to be like, yeah, I've got $60 million in the bank, no problem, let me just write a check. Like, I would imagine that's not a very easy check to write, probably not a very easy check to talk to ownership about. But I do think if you're a team that has the capability to make that leap, you probably are getting a little bit of a bargain.
And Dan, you were saying before that you thought it could be a move that teams that are coming up could make, that if it's a rebuilding squad and they want to just come up with this monster prospect who could be the best player on the team, maybe it makes more sense from that point of view than it does for a team that's projected to win 90 games this year. They're an older team. This guy's not going to help them for a couple years in the big leagues. I mean, could there be merit to, well, I was going to say Kansas City, but I mean, they're on the rise at this point, but a team that's kind of trying to come up and make their way to do that, knowing that their best players are going to come up maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, would that be the move?
Sure. I mean, there's some amount of like competitive capital you have as a team. If you've been losing and so you acquire different amounts of draft picks, or if you've been able to trade players to acquire younger players or whatever. This is a player that only costs money, right? And so you could imagine that if you're a team that doesn't want to spend these other resources, you could only spend money. On the other hand, I imagine it's tough to sell an ownership group. We were terrible, and we're going to project to be terrible for the next year, but this guy will really help us in 3 years. And that's an incredible amount of money, $60 million. And so there's some amount of give and take. That it's sort of difficult to piece together, exactly where this player fits in on your team right now, and so that's got to be a sort of difficult sell, to an ownership group.
And this could be moot because the international draft could come up and there might not be any more Moncadas. I mean, does that change dramatically the way teams think about their budgets, and do they do something different, Ben? I mean, do they just shift it and they're not worrying about this stuff anymore?
Right, and it's got to be a tough decision. Again, not the GM on the panel. But if you are a GM, usually the future-oriented move is a cost-saving move in the short term, or at least it's not a very expensive move. Whereas Moncada is completely different. He is, a long-term play. He's a guy who might not be in the league for 2-3 years. He maybe comes with some of the risk that a prospect comes with, and yet you're paying right now as you would for a player who's expected to produce right away. So if you're a GM, to some extent, you have to win in the short term, or you won't be around when Moncada is in the major leagues contributing. I'm not talking about anyone personally, but you have to kind of factor that in when you make that decision, and maybe it's a tough sell to ownership, and it's also a tough thing to go all in on at the expense of the current roster.
Go ahead.
Let me just add to that. I think that focus primarily on the cost associated with that and the planning involved, but there's also some opportunity cost. So if you look at the international pool, not only are they paying a tax, but they're prohibited from signing players in excess of $350,000 for the next 2 years, I believe. So there's a certain amount of, I don't know if you call it portfolio theory or not, but if you took the $60 million, and given the fact in any year you can go as high as you want, subject to these future penalties, would you rather have the $60 million in one player, assuming he's an outstanding prospect, but not necessarily someone who's going to contribute immediately? Or theoretically, would you take that $60 million and spend it among 10 players, 15 players, 20 players, so that you have, some diversification? So it's not just about the cash flow, and it's not just about payroll versus signing bonus. Because I can remember years ago, if you think about a major league budget, there are really two major items. One is payroll, and the other is signing bonus in the overall scheme of things. And if you're in a position where you can shift between those two line items, you're in great shape. That requires that maybe you don't spend quite as much of your payroll as you are allowed early on, and shift it back and forth. It's not as relevant today because of these pool numbers, but the idea that you're diversified. So we looked at Moncada, and just from a hypothetical standpoint, because we'd never really got involved, looking at some of the players we've signed over the last couple of years and where they are today, would we have preferred to forego those players in order to be all in on one? And the fact he's a position player, not a pitcher, is a positive thing, but you're always looking to discount the cost for the probability that they're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
And in this kind of situation, you're not getting the discount, and so you're really sort of on the clock.
Well, and I throw this right back to you guys then. You mentioned the hypothetical about, okay, here's one superstar prospect versus we could diversify to 10. But the old trope that we hear all the time in scouting and baseball in general is the one guy is the franchise maker. You get Ken Griffey Jr., that's worth more than 10. That's worth unlimited. It doesn't matter. He's the one guy in the draft. You want him. What do you do then? I mean, if you're building a team, are you envisioning balance more? Are you saying, you know what, Moncada, we project him to be whatever, pick your comp. He could be Robinson Cano or whoever. We got to go for this guy versus 10. I mean, analytically, what is the move there, or is it not obvious necessarily?
Yeah, I think there's two different theories. So at the major league level, I'm more of a balanced roster guy than a stars and scrubs guy. I think like what the A's have done the last few years of just adding depth to their depth and having layers of players that can step in and contribute and not have holes. I think that makes sense at the major league level in this current market environment where stars are getting a lot of money. At the minor league level, though, I do think if you study prospects, it's definitely a curve, right? Like the top picks and the top prospects perform exponentially better than the next tier, and it drops off very quickly. Like the 1-1 guy is much better than 1-2, and then by the time you're at like 6 or 7, it's a huge drop down. And so I do think at the minor league level, especially with these kind of the ability to get a long-term extension for if you hit an Andrew McCutchen and then you can sign him for an extra 4 years. It's not just 6 years of team control anymore. Now you're getting 10 or 11 or one of these discount deals. If you can get a guy like that, it's probably worth taking a shot, at least from the numbers. Not that I'm an expert here, but I would say
In numbers, I think you are.
Well,
I think that's fair.
compared to someone at the end of the panel, maybe.
Okay.
I would say from the numbers, you probably would rather have 1 or 2 star prospects than 20 solid prospects.
I mean, do you guys agree, disagree? Go ahead.
Well, just in response to that, I think you need to keep in mind that in this particular case, you're comparing a 19-year-old who's not 22 or 23, but not 16 either.
Right.
And most of the prospects coming out of the Dominican Republic and Venezuela are 16, 17 years old. And in my experience, the projectability of those players is very difficult. You know, one of the reasons that teams tend to sign lots of players in places like Venezuela and the Dominican Republic and so forth is that you don't really know what you're going to get. And the guys that get the big bonuses don't always turn out. Why? Because they're 16 years old, or at least they claim to be 16 years old. So,
what are you implying? Come on.
it's a little different projection at 16 than it is at 19 than it is at, say, 22. And this goes back to another topic. We've got all these top 10 prospects. So Moncada is like number 9 already, or number 6. Really? I mean, maybe he is, but this also gets back to this whole notion of analytics, and the amount of information available is incredible. Even on the 16-year-olds now in places like the Dominican Republic, there's so much more information, which leads to more analysis, which again gets back to value and probabilities and things of that sort. But again, in this particular case, what we'd be looking at is 10 or 15, 16 and a half year olds, and just based on what we see, it's sometimes very difficult to know where they're going to end up. Sure. So,
go ahead.
Although the strange thing is we've talked about this a little. There's a real likelihood that the system is going to change very shortly. And so, if this is the last time that you have the ability to go get this player, and then, in 2 months, somebody's going to say, well, actually, all the rules of that old system, they don't apply anymore. You actually get all the players you were going to get anyway. That there's going to be a draft, and you don't actually have to worry about all those penalties. Just kidding. That also sort of changes the calculus, right? Because, maybe there are no penalties. We don't know what the new system is going to do to people who break the rules now. And so, you wonder to what extent there's a sort of a penalty for playing by the rules. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're not willing to incur that penalty because, you don't think it's right and you don't think it works for your organization and you don't want to sacrifice those extra players down the line, the rules to the system change and you no longer have to suffer the penalties, then you've come out way ahead.
Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second, but hopefully in a good way. We were talking before about the penalty being $60 million and that they were budgeting it being maybe $5 million in the kitty or whatever. There's not $85 million, I think you were saying was around the number, that Major League Baseball could literally do anything right now in the kitty. It's just sitting there. It's not in the CBA. You could do anything. You have $85 million. You're running baseball. What are you doing with it?
I don't know. It seems like one of the initiatives that Rob Manfred has promoted the most recently is amateur baseball and kind of, making sure kids are playing, making sure there's a good quality of coaching, making sure, people in the inner city can play, making sure there's just standardization, there's fields everywhere. that seems like a pretty good place to put money as a long-term investment.
Anybody else have $85 million just lands in your lap? You can do anything you
I
want?
would like to hire a replay ump to just go to every single stadium, and then we have a fifth umpire
Yes.
sitting there watching things. We don't have to go down in the tunnel. It's like the fifth umpire to me makes the most sense for replay. I think it's a perfect solution, and the only reason I've ever heard that they can't have a fifth umpire in every stadium just watching the screen, like buzzing in, being like, yeah, foul ball or whatever, is cost, right? So like it's always been a cost issue. Now we have to have, X
Really-
amount more umpires. and-
Really well-paid umpire.
yeah, right.
What do you do with the other $83 million?
Okay, well, that's
Boat, an island somewhere.
I don't know.
I'm just saying, like,
I
cruise
think
liner.
at that point you buy Fangraphs. That's,
That's
we're for sale for $83 million on the record.
sound business advice. Since the title of the panel is related to shifts, let's talk a little bit about shifts. It's become one of the hot topics in baseball. And let's actually start with Ben, just because you wrote a whole article about this recently. This came up because the commissioner, one of his first initiatives, well, not one of the first initiatives, but somebody just asked him a bunch of questions. And, hey, what would you do to, change the game, this, that? And he said, well, hypothetically, we could ban shifts, because that's obviously going to help offense. And I think we all kind of looked askance at that and said, well, I don't know about that. And then you wrote a piece talking about it. Why don't you believe that to be the case?
I think everyone in this room wrote a piece.
Probably, yeah.
It was the dead of winter, and we were all so happy that Rob Manfred said something that we could write about. I think the general response was sort of that, there's not a whole lot of evidence that the shift has been one of the big drivers of the offensive decline, that maybe it's affected certain hitters disproportionately, but if you look at the batting average on balls in play, league-wide, it doesn't seem to have decreased. And it could be that the shift is just offsetting some other trend. Maybe guys are hitting the ball harder and the BABIP would have gone up otherwise. But it seems like if your goal is to increase offense, that's maybe not the best place to start. And yet, I think, it's a good thing that he brought it up. He kind of got killed for saying it.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like that is the commissioner's role to a certain extent. If teams are doing something that helps teams but could be hurting baseball, that's where the league or the commissioner has to step in. So I'm glad that there is some watchdog, kind of keeping track of those things. And it was just an offhand comment. So, I don't think I hope it doesn't discourage him from entertaining other ideas. It seems like he's been very open to talking about things, just kind of off the cuff, which is nice. I think should be commended.
I want to ask Sandy, related to the shift, one team which has been interesting to me over the last few years is the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the way that they've improved for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is their extreme focus on run prevention, specifically related to defense. And if you look at how much better they've become, they've deployed the shift very aggressively. And think about who the guys are in their infield. You got Neil Walker and Pedro Alvarez, and these are not wildly athletic, incredible Andrelton Simmons types, and yet they're just getting to all these ground balls and they're doing a good job of that. Does the proliferation of the shift cause you to rethink player acquisition strategy a little bit? You could say, well, this guy's a little bit of a statue at second base, but he can bob 20 homers, and we don't have to worry about it because we got a shift. Do you change how you look at free agents or even your own prospects in that light?
Well, first of all, I give the Pirates a lot of credit for not only coming up with their shift strategy, but actually their execution of that strategy.
Yes.
Because, something that we could talk about more generally, but it's one thing to have the data. It's another thing to actually execute on the field level. And there's a lot of translation and communication and education that has to take place among staff and players in order to get that result. So I give them a tremendous amount of credit for that. On the other hand, from my standpoint, looking at the shift, and by the way, I think it's great that Rob brings up these topics because it elicits a whole host of educated responses, which I think then inform the decision-making going forward. So I think just getting the topic out there is great. From my standpoint, I've always looked at it, and I'm on the rules committee, so that's probably a little ironic for me to say this, but my attitude typically is, tell me what the rules are and we'll play. And so whether the shifts are outlawed or not, to me is almost immaterial. And by the way, as time goes on and more clubs adapt to the shift strategy, the competitive advantage disappears.
Yeah.
Not completely, but over time. So if you had a reset, we eliminated the shifts, now you're talking about a different set of rules and another opportunity to early adopt an approach to those new rules which underscores the importance of innovation and sort of intellect all over again. So I don't get all caught up in, the shift or no shift. I think the shift has killed the 30 home run, 320 left-handed hitter. But, and there's a lot of talk about beating the shift and so forth. But from an operating standpoint, I take the position more, tell me what the rules are and we'll figure it out. And there's always an opportunity for a competitive advantage. So.
Well, that's interesting, that the idea of killing, that's a pretty strong statement. If it really could kill the 30 home run 320 guy, if, I don't know, David Ortiz became a free agent tomorrow, or, well, a guy who gets smoked by the shift is Mike Moustakas. I mean, does that literally, are you rethinking how you want, any of you guys can jump in, do you rethink how you want to approach free agency at that point? Do you spend less money because this is happening?
I mean, I think one of the things we saw this winter was a surge in pricing for right-handed hitters, right? Like you signed Michael Kadire early in the offseason. Some people were surprised you gave up a draft pick to do it. And then we saw Billy Butler get more than it. I mean, I think every right-handed hitter with some power got 10%, 20, 30% more than we expected going into the winter. It seems like teams are potentially adjusting and saying, you know what I'd really like is right-handed hitters who are much harder to shift, especially right-handed hitters who can hit the ball all over the field. At that point, they're basically unshiftable. It does seem like there was a premium placed on that. Whether that's a valid response to the shift or if it's an overcorrection, I'm not sure. But it does seem like teams are maybe putting more value on right-handed hitting than they have before.
To the point where the San Diego Padres are literally just
all right-handed.
Yeah, well, this guy doesn't really play center field. He's a catcher, but okay, we'll put him there. It's fine. It makes no difference. And then we talked also about, you're talking about the implementation of these things, and I'm interested in the buy-in, of how guys are willing to do it or not. What if they're going to be okay with the shift? I know A.J. Burnett, when he was pitching for the Pirates, complained about it, and A.J. Burnett had a pretty good year with the Pirates, and he ultimately signed elsewhere. He ended up coming back, but it became a controversy. What is the way to make this happen effectively, just to hire really good communicators, to get somebody somewhere between the person who came up with the idea for the shift and the player to be there and communicate? The person who comes to mind is the Rangers' new manager. He did such a good job in Pittsburgh in so many different ways. They said, okay, well, we feel that this guy's a good communicator. I mean, that's always been an important aspect of baseball, is finding people who run a clubhouse well and communicate well and so forth. Is it even more important now that we've got such intricate strategies going on in the game?
Well, there's a reason they sometimes shoot the messenger. So it's the message that's important, but the messenger can be just as important. And so I think you're right. It's a matter of getting players and staff to buy in. And ultimately, if the staff buys in, how does the staff get the players to buy in? So if you're thinking just in terms of a shift, we had one starting pitcher last year who absolutely would not allow the shift. He just reacted so negatively when he saw a ground ball go through a spot where typically, historically, through his entire career, it would have been an out. He couldn't handle it, so there was no. Now that was a failure on our part of educating, that player. But my guess is we'll have shifts across the board this year, just because of what transpired last year with that sort of foundation. But there's no question that being able to communicate this in a way that gets through, that has credibility, is critically important. And it's part of that chain of implementation that goes from, okay, we got all this data, what the hell are we going to do with it, to actually getting, and it's not just the pitcher, it's the second baseman, it's the third baseman, so it's a complicated process, and being able to communicate can be critically important, yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, just on that topic, one of the things that I've heard from a couple, analytics guys with teams and things like that is that one of the things that's difficult about the shift in the major leagues is that when you get to the majors, suddenly you have all this, these coaches that are telling you, it's better if you stand 15 feet over to the left. We're going to change everything. But your entire career through the minor leagues and before that, nobody was really telling you how to reposition, or if you're a pitcher, your infielders are always in the same place. And so many organizations, to the best of my knowledge, are now starting to employ these kinds of strategies all the way through. Give their players this kind of data, even if it's not as clean as what happens in the majors, or give their coaches this kind of data, so that they can start to incorporate these kinds of adjustments as they sort of come through the system. The analogy that was used was like, if you're Dustin Pedroia and you're asked to move 20 feet to the left or whatever because that's a better place, that's where balls are hit. It's sort of like asking someone, just change seats, drive on the other side of the car. And it's not a big, right? From our perspective, why would it be a big deal if Dustin Pedroia moved 20 feet to the left? But from his perspective, he's been doing one thing his entire career. That could be a really sort of a big change, right? Totally different vantage point on the ball. Totally different kinds of ways he can throw. You know what I mean? So it could be a big shift for a player like that. And so working it in
Literally.
Yeah. Right.
So what
No
we really
pun
need is
intended.
Tom Amansky to come out of retirement and have a Little League
Yes.
shift video. Tom Amansky teaches the youth of America, stand 20 feet to the left.
Did you want to jump in?
And a lot of teams have created a new kind of coach, sort of like with very football-style titles, defensive coordinator, or guys who serve as a liaison between the front office and the field staff, or the front office and the players, and maybe sort of speak the same language, maybe have a playing background and can communicate these things more effectively. The Pirates have a guy in the front office, an analyst, who travels with them on the road almost full time. He's in the managers' meetings, he's in the coaching staff meetings, and he can kind of go back and forth between these two camps that maybe have different backgrounds and don't always know how to communicate very efficiently to each other. So there's no real limit on non-uniformed coaches you can have. So teams have really started expanding in that direction.
Just the one thing I would add is that I think the point was well made, that players have to become acclimated to information as they're coming through a system. So it may not be that a minor league team is using the shift significantly, but let's say, for example, a team has a particular hitting approach, hitting philosophy that is information driven. It's about educating the players as to why you're doing something is always going to be important. And to the extent that they, over the course of their minor league careers, become comfortable with that kind of input, which again has to be collated and translated and communicated at the minor league level, then they're more comfortable at the major league level when they're told, move 20 feet. It's not about moving 20 feet. It's like, okay, I understand the data, I understand the importance of this information, and as a consequence, I'm willing to do this. It's not as if they have to be re-educated at the major league level. If you're doing the same kinds of things, teaching them to hit, teaching them to field, doing all those physical things, but at the same time also exposing them to this kind of analysis, maybe in a more simplified form, but nonetheless, part of their development process.
There's definitely at least one enterprising person in this audience who's going to go back and watch video of all 162 Mets games last year and figure out which pitcher it is that was complaining about it.
Won't take long.
And
sure.
if that pitcher's name rhymes with Schmack Schmeeler, then we'll see. Maybe it will and maybe it won't. Let's move on to pace of the game. That's become a big topic as well. There's talk of a pitch clock. I mean, there's all kinds of things. I will actually weigh in with my opinion first. I'm not sure clock is the first move that you make. I believe it's actually in the rule book that you have to keep 1 foot in the batter's box. And the article I keep referring to was written by a guy named Travis Sawchik, who writes for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. And he just literally put a stopwatch on how long batters were out of the box over the course of one game, just a random Pirates game. 39 minutes and 51 seconds. 40 minutes during the course of a game, there's a dude doing whatever. And if you cut it in half, that's 20 minutes off a game. That would make a big difference. And so I'm wondering if, well, my opinion is that just literally enforcing that and not worrying so much about the clock would make all the difference in the world. Because if the guy's in the box, it should theoretically prompt the pitcher to throw quicker and so forth. Do you need that cudgel of a clock to make that happen? Or can the umpire just say, here's the rule, I'm going to enforce it? And feel free to jump in, anybody.
Well, from my standpoint, now, when I worked at Major League Baseball, I supervised umpires, and one of the things we also focused on was pace of game. And about the time I left the commissioner's office, the average time per game was 2 minutes and 46 seconds. It's now like 3:02, 3:03.
Yeah.
The reason I mention that is because, and mentioned umpires, is because it's not about the rules, it's about the enforcement of the rules. And it's difficult over a long period of time to come up with a more or less artificial means of enforcement. The umpires, they don't lose interest, they get exhausted doing it. So really the clock is the enforcer. It's not the rule per se, it's the enforcer. And if the clock clicks over at 20 seconds or whatever it happens to be, then it doesn't require a lot of initiative on the part of the umpire to take whatever, consequence is appropriate. So to me, the clock is this inanimate object that takes the place of a human being that sort of has to be constantly reminded and supervised to do this. The only rule change between the 246 time frame and the 302 time frame is replay. So it can be done, but we have to make it easier to accomplish, and I think that's where ultimately the clock is going to come into play.
What do we do with scofflaws like David Ortiz? He came out the other day and said, well, I don't care. I'm going to spit on my hands, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. It's all fine. I'm David Ortiz. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to pay my fines. I make $15 million a year, and it's not a problem. There's nothing stopping other players from doing that if it's literally just relatively small fines. I mean, could this get to the point where players are saying, I'm doing my routine, and I'm going to buck this trend, and it doesn't matter?
Well, I think the important thing is the Players Association has bought into this at the major league level. They
They're going to challenge David
They have
Ortiz?
agreed
All right.
that they're going to stay in the box, and they've agreed to these penalties. Now, what's interesting is, in thinking about it, the problem is not David Ortiz. David Ortiz is part of the entertainment value of a Boston Red Sox game, and so we might sit there for 5 minutes and watch David Ortiz do, his whole thing, and it's fun to watch. But when, the backup shortstop is doing it, we're not interested. And so, to some extent, you may find that David Ortiz gets, I don't know, but you may find that he gets a little latitude. Why? Because he's fun to watch. But the other 99 guys that are doing it are not fun to watch, and we need to, pick up the pace. So, we'll see how it gets enforced.
I would love to see this enforced on the super objective criterion of, oh, that guy's entertaining to watch, no problem. That'd be great. Go ahead. Dan.
Right.
I guess, who are we, maybe this is an unfair, but who exactly are we speeding up games for? I guess that's
That's a good question.
yeah. People who complain about this, beat writers, right? That would be annoying if your job was to watch, you had to sit there and it was, 8 to 2 and you had to be writing a game story and you had to be in the park and David Ortiz is spitting on his hands. And, that's 40 minutes of your life you're never getting back. But people who enjoy baseball for the most part, I don't hear people, not that beat writers don't enjoy baseball, but I mean for the most part, I don't hear people saying I really love the Red Sox. I just wish they would be over in 15 minutes. You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't get the sense from friends of mine that watch baseball that we wished the World Series games had all been half an hour shorter. And if we don't wish the World Series games had been half an hour shorter, that's going to happen, right? So that was fun. That the tension of somebody stepping out of the batter's box, and trying to figure out what the next pitch was, and Madison Bumgarner staring in, and maybe taking a minute to walk off the mound. If they had a little thing that was Madison Bumgarner's just racked up $7,500 in fines. I don't know that it would be any more fun to me if it was 15 minutes faster.
So I think one thing interesting that Manfred said yesterday is he distinctly drew a line between length of game, which is what you're talking about, and pace of play, right? They're two different issues, which is what I actually agree with him. I think length of game is not necessarily a problem. I'm totally fine with a 3-hour baseball game, as long as it's an exciting 3-hour baseball game. So I live in North Carolina, there's no baseball team within 5 hours of my house. Most of my friends in real life are not hardcore baseball fans who watch the Red Sox every night, and I try to get them to watch a game with me, and their complaint is almost always, why are they taking so long to do anything? The time between actionable events is too long, I think, for the casual fan. I think that's what Manfred was talking about yesterday, is trying to shrink the time between interesting events. And if the game takes 3 hours because there's more interesting events, that's great. But if we're having a 3-hour game with 4 interesting events because it ended 1-0, that's a problem.
Yeah, and you and I and our friends are not necessarily the target for this move. I think, we all know people who don't watch baseball, and maybe one of the reasons that they cite is the length of game or the pace of game. So we want to convince those people. And I think the changes that have been instituted for this season are pretty modest. The batters keeping 1 foot in the box, that's only on take-in pitches, right? And managers have to stay in the dugout, but they still can consult with their replay people. And, they might not make a dramatic difference, but I think just arresting the rise would be a victory. Both with the time of game and with the strikeout rate, for instance, if we could just stop the rise, because part of the fear is extrapolating and saying if it continues to rise like this, where will we be in a few years? So I think the pitch clock is maybe, it's a pretty invasive move, and maybe you try other things first. I think, one other possibility is limiting the number of pitchers in a game, just because it addresses a lot of baseball's big problems all at once. If you limit the number of pitchers in a game, they have to pace themselves, which means, well, first of all, you're eliminating the pitching change dead time, but they also have to pace themselves, which means probably throwing less hard, which means fewer strikeouts, which means more scoring, and might mean fewer injuries too. So you're kind of hitting everything, every crisis in baseball at once. So that's something to consider.
Obviously, shifting is a way that defenses influence the game quite a bit. Excuse me. Another way, which has been around forever, but now we can measure it better, is pitch framing. And this has come up a lot. You and your colleague, Harry, and the bunch of you wrote a big article, Baseball Prospectus, putting into relief something that we've been able to kind of measure better and better over the last couple of years. And I'm wondering, now that we've got this pretty robust data, and we'll start with you, Dan, do you think teams are underestimating the value of pitch framing? Are guys undervalued? Should Jose Molina be making $50 million a year right now instead of playing golf somewhere? I mean, where are we at with this?
Maybe. So, pitch framing is one of those things that, John Judge and Harry and I had an article a couple weeks ago, but many different people have looked at this. Yeah. Many of those people have now been hired away into MLB front offices, actually. But to the best of my knowledge, everybody who's tried to measure it has found sort of similar things, which is that it seems to be pretty valuable, and it seems to be unaccounted for in the player market. That these people are not being adequately paid based on what we might mark their value as. So to that extent, sure. To that extent, yeah. Probably not $50 million. I'm
known for hyperbole, okay.
Yeah, but some large number million more than he's making this year, probably. I think it's a really interesting skill, right? Because it lives at sort of the margins of fair play, which sort of makes it a little bit. It feels a little bit slimy, right? Like when you got a guy who can hit home runs, like nobody feels bad about when you have a guy that you're paying $20 million because his job is to hit balls really far. Everybody feels a little bit bad, I think, when you're paying a guy whose job it is to steal strikes, and so I don't know. I don't know why it hasn't been properly priced into the market. It may be because we're all reading it wrong.
You're a skeptic, right? Or you're not.
So I believe in the value of the tool. I don't know that I completely buy into the range of runs that we're saying. I think maybe we're crediting some of what is the pitcher to the catcher. I think pitch framing is a skill. I was also thinking about this the other day from a market standpoint. If we, and enough teams now, I think, believe in this as a thing that they want to pay for, and we still haven't seen prices go up. Ryan Hannigan's been traded 140 times in the last 12 months. I think if we say, why are teams not paying for this? Why is this market inefficiency taking so long to clear when so many others seem to move quickly? There's an interesting constraint here that isn't at play in any other spot, right? When on-base percentage was a big undervalued thing, you could buy on-base percentage at 9 spots. You could just fill your team with on-base percentage. You cannot fill your team with catcher framing, right? You have a spot for one catcher who maybe plays 100 to 110 games a year. So you could get 2 of them maybe if you have the Padres and you have 2 really good framers, and now you're getting 140 or 150 good games. But you have a roster games played constraint on this skill that makes it very hard for the market to clear this thing, I think, as quickly as they have other, if short pitchers are a potential inefficiency. You can have 12 short pitchers, but you can't have 12 good framers. And so I think you have 5 or 6 or 7 teams that really buy into this, and there's 15 good framing catchers. Okay, well, we can't get all of those teams on all of the good framers.
I just want to say real quick, there's also because you can only get one guy, it's hard to experiment. You know what I mean? So often, often teams say, we're trying this out, we'll get 1 or 2 players like this, see how they contribute to value or whatever. You can't really experiment with your big league catcher. He's your guy, and he's the guy that you have to have more or less all season, has to have a good rapport with your pitchers, good rapport with the rest of the coaching staff. You can't be like, well, we'll sacrifice a lot of offense because often that ends up happening, but, we'll try out this catcher framing thing. It's, it's a hard thing to sort of go in on.
Yeah,
I think that I think that clubs have bought into the framing argument, but I think right now it's a preference and not a value component. And partly it's because I think there's a sense that this might be ephemeral. It may be difficult to know whether a guy's going to be good long term. And by the way, it takes a big investment. I mean, you're not going to get a small sample and draw conclusions. The other thing that's interesting is that it's caused some discussion about the relative merits of framing versus maybe something else that suffers as a result of framing. So take, as an illustration, pass balls. If a guy is doing his best to frame pitches, there can be a correlation between his framing effort and the number of pass balls that end up occurring. So then it becomes another educational process, making sure the pitcher, the pitching coach, et cetera, understands the relative value. And so you say to yourself, okay, wins above replacement or whatever, additional wins per season on a net basis, if you assume that the framing is a positive but something else may be a negative, it requires you to kind of walk through that. But I think the point being made that there aren't that many of them that are good. We sort of know who the good ones are.
Darno's.
Yeah, we've got a good
highly.
one. Yeah, but it's an argument to be made in favor of a player, but as I said before, at this point I think it's more like a preference, except for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 teams. If you've got one, you're happy. If you don't have one, then you kind of slough it off and say it's not that important, and we do something else. So there's a certain amount of justification that goes on. But at some point, 1 of 2 things will happen. Either the umpires will adjust, or this will continue to be an area of competitive advantage, and people will start to pay for it.
Yeah, and I mean, my love for Jose Molina is larger than Jose Molina, but like he
is it slower?
He made a really good, sort of slate pitch illustration of this concept. Like, look at this one weird trick that this backup catcher does to make him a really good player. He was also awful at everything else. Terrible hitter.
A lot of pass balls too, by the way. That was an interesting point
bad
when you
pitch
said
blocker,
that. Yeah.
bad base runner, not very durable, old. I mean, just the fact that he was playing and starting at his age after being a career backup, I think, showed that teams were valuing this. I would say it's probably still somewhat undervalued, but there's also the question of, can it be taught? Can we make our own good pitch framer instead of buying one on the free agent market? I was talking to Austin Hedges, the Padres prospect, a few weeks ago, who is like the super framer in the upper minors, and he thinks it's 100% a learned skill that you can teach anyone. And not all catchers will say that, but it's interesting that he said that, since that's what his value rests on almost completely at this point. And so if you can teach it, and there are examples of guys like JP Arencibia worked with Sal Fasano in Toronto, and suddenly his framing numbers improved. If you can do that, then maybe you can save yourself some money and develop your own guy.
I interviewed Jonathan Lucroy in spring training last year, and he talked about that it was a learned skill too, but the thing that he also mentioned was that he's small. And so Maldonado's not a big guy either. Mm-hmm. And if you watch Lucroy crouch, he gets down there. He's low. He's flexible, but he's also small. And he was saying that a big part of it is the low strike. We talk about strikeouts being up in baseball and offense being down. It's because this low strike is being called. So yes, he can get the pitch on the outside corner, but he's catching the ball here, and they're calling it a strike. And that's invaluable. And I'm wondering if, maybe the next step in framing analysis is to really look at that kind of granular, well, he's specifically doing it this way, like that could even be more important. And to your point, by the way, about umpires, and this is a good segue too, I've been lobbying for the robot umpire revolution for the last 6 years. I mean, I don't really like human beings very much, and I think we should change it up. And if umpires are really being deceived by this, if these are really balls, is there at all a valid argument? First of all, I don't know if it's feasible or not, but could there in some hypothetical world be a feasible argument for trying to automate this thing if this was really theoretically an illegal play? And anybody can jump in here.
Well, I would distinguish between robots and robotic umpires. And I've always, again, I think I'm fairly progressive, but whipping out a robot to call balls and strikes is probably a little bit beyond where I would go. In fact, I kind of lament the loss of the human element of umpiring that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. The first manager I ever worked with was Billy Martin. And there's nothing greater than a big dust-up between Billy Martin and some umpire, or Earl Weaver and Ron Luciano. That's part of the game, that I think we've somewhat lost. We don't see a lot of arguments. We go to replay. So that doesn't answer the question per se. Would we be better? Would we have a better strike zone? Yeah, we'd have a better strike zone. But I think we do have to temper, where we go with some of this, so that we don't lose entirely the human element of the game.
Yeah, my thinking on this has kind of evolved or possibly devolved. I'll let you guys decide. But I used to think accuracy was the only consideration, that we have to get the strike zone called as it is in the rule book. And it is much closer to that, in part because of changes that Sandy made and ways that umpires are graded now. And I think it probably could be even better, even more accurate, but I kind of look at it like park effects or ballpark construction. You could construct every field with the same dimensions, and a deep fly ball would be a home run in every park or a home run in no parks for the most part. And that would maybe be fairer, but I don't know if it would be more interesting. I think it adds a level of complexity and analysis that we can, say this guy would be better in a certain park. It adds a level of strategy that a team can build its roster in such a way to take advantage of this. So I sort of look at the strike zone kind of the same way, that variety is the spice of life in a sense. I don't know whether we want to remove one of the big differentiators in catcher defense completely, do away with the tendency for the zone to expand or contract in the count, because that makes each plate appearance more interesting in a way. It favors the underdog in that count. There's a better chance that he can come back and do something in that count if the zone expands or contracts. So to me, we know how it works. It's not arbitrary, right? Like, you don't want maybe pre-Humidor Coors Field, and maybe you don't want Eric Gregg in the 97 NLCS, right? But within a certain margin, I think some variety is good, and you can build your team in such a way that you can take advantage of it. You can study the umpire differences, you can get a good framer, you can be aware of these things, and you can use it to your advantage.
I also wonder what happens if the robot umpire screws up. Like, I wonder, what happens if, it's the bottom of the ninth in the World Series and, the robot umpire goes offline? I don't know. No, but it's a silly point, but it's one of those points where, people would love it if a major tech company released a driverless car that reduced traffic fatalities by 100-fold. But the traffic fatalities that did occur were just the car randomly driving off a bridge or whatever, and that would be really scary to people. And so, but I don't know that replacing a human that has the ability to make these kinds of decisions, based on what he perceives as fair at the time, is really a good idea if it means sort of getting the downside of hey, the system went offline, so that pitch just didn't count. Wait while we reboot the umpire. That would be sort of a strange system, and I just wonder, what the interplay would be like. So, I'm sort of happy with the idea of having human beings do these things.
I wonder if there was any machine learning experts in the audience who could program a foul-mouthed robot to appease Sandy. If we could have a robot that's like, F you, man, and your sister, we could get a robot.
Wow, things turn dark.
This is like a Earl Weaver robot.
One more question, we'll take some, I've got some questions here from the audience. StatCast, which was introduced here actually last year, super interesting. Obviously measures trajectory of fly balls, the angle at which a fielder can go after the ball, the speed at which they do it, the root efficiency, there's all kinds of stuff. And we're starting to get this play-by-play data. It's funny, I've been talking to some basketball people at this conference, And baseball analytics was ahead of basketball for a long time, but spatially, it seems like basketball's kind of taken the lead a little bit with the sport view cameras, and things are interesting, and StatCast is meant to obviously bridge that gap. What are the possibilities with this thing? We're a year in, we have a little taste here and there of what it can possibly do. Obviously, the most obvious thing is that we could see maybe a little bit more accurately than UZR, DRS, or whatever, how good a fielder is. But I mean, is there more to that? What are the nooks and crannies that we can unlock by having this product? And anybody can jump in.
I mean, I think it's all about sample size, really. I mean, there might be some guys that it completely changes our perception of the player. But, you look at PitchFX, and it's taught us a lot about pitchers, but it hasn't necessarily revealed that a bad pitcher is actually good or a good pitcher is actually bad. We kind of knew that, you throw hard and you have these nasty pitches, you're probably a pretty good pitcher. But we can now tell if you're going to be a good pitcher, maybe in a single start. We can look at your stuff and see how it compares to other pitchers and whether that would lead to success. So I think with StatCast, it's sort of the same thing. Like if we have 3 years of defensive stats, I don't know that it would completely change our perception of what those stats would say, but we might be able to tell in a few games that a guy gets a good jump or he takes a good route, and maybe that's something that would extend throughout the season. So I think, it lets you come to the same conclusions much more quickly, at least.
I would just add one comment, sort of as a user. One, I think it'll be fun to start with. I think it'll be interesting and something to play with. But I also think that, the more granular this information becomes, the better understood everything becomes. So just as an example, when we had radar guns and everybody's measuring speed, what we've done over the years is focused almost exclusively on velocity. Why? Because we have a tool to measure it. Now with TrackMan and some other things, we can measure spin rates and a bunch of other things, and now suddenly we have a handle on something other than velocity. So it's great to be able to measure something, but ultimately you have to weight it properly. And one of the benefits of this more detailed information is that I think it'll give us a better perspective on the information we already have, and maybe lead to a more well-rounded approach to our assessment of players. So that, for example, if velocity really is the reason that we're having some of these elbow injuries and so forth, or a significant contributor, having more of this information is going to help us perhaps come back to a more balanced assessment of a player and a more balanced sense of how to develop that player. So, I think it's going to be, number one, it's going to be fun, and number two, I think it will be interesting, and I totally agree. I don't think it's going to change, our assessment of a great player significantly. It's going to maybe help us, on the margins, but I doubt it's going to be totally revolutionary, but I'm looking forward to it because I think it'll be great fun.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dan.
I think the other thing is from an outsider's perspective. If you're a baseball insider, you can send scouts to all these games, and for the most part, they can tell you, or they could tell you, how much does a guy's curveball move relative to other people who threw curveballs, and you could have this information at some level already in your system and use that to evaluate your decisions of that player. If you're on the outside, before PitchFX and TrackMan and stuff, we didn't have access to that kind of information. We don't really have access to how good how good a guy's jump is on a ball in the outfield. There's no publicly available rating system. And so that's a place where, at least in the public domain, I think, and they seem to be committed to this, I think StatCast is going to change the way that we, outside of baseball, can evaluate defense or evaluate players. And I think Ben's right that, probably we're not going to learn that the best defender is actually the worst defender and the worst defender is actually the best defender. It's just sort of a new piece of information that has already existed to some extent in baseball for a long time. But outside of baseball, I think is where we're really going to get, have our eyes open to a huge, new amount of information that we didn't have before.
Sometimes we think information exists within baseball, and we're kidding ourselves. So I've been in spring training for the last week and a half, and all we've with the pitchers, basically we've thrown sides, and yesterday wasn't live BP, it was live tracking. So, and inevitably the first week of spring training, it's like, God, that guy looked fantastic, his fastball. Somebody came up to me yesterday and said, what do you think, it was 94, 95? I said, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether it's 94, 95 or 91, 92 by the naked eye, and I've been around for a long time. We kid ourselves sometimes that we think we know when we don't. And so this information, again, you're talking about people that are information driven, and I think that's the difference in the game today as opposed to 30 years ago. Most organizations, not all, are information driven, and it's just a question of how they use it. But one of the ways you start to use it is by admitting to yourself that it's useful because your perceptions are exactly that, and they're not always accurate.
I'm excited about StatCast for the things we might not know we're going to learn. Like I talked to a friend who had 3 games, the kind of the sample that the teams were given at the end of the year, and it was 30 frames per second for 4 hours with no breaks, and it wasn't itemized or anything. So they're like digging through this mountainous pool of data, and they're like, man, look at this fascinating little thing. And then they went through it a little bit more, and they're like, oh, those are the groundskeepers sweeping the field. Like that, so now we're gonna have like groundskeeper FX, which I'm really excited about. I like really want to know between the innings, like the mascot races, like let's see which hot dog actually runs fastest. Let's do president's FX, in national. I think that's gonna be a lot of fun.
You just have to add FX to it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
We ran through a bunch of questions, mostly because of my obsession with the robot revolution and Skynet. So we'll try to, we don't have much time for the audience questions, but I want to get to one. We got like basically a minute or two. How do we feel about war these days? Is that, I feel like we should open that can of worms at this point. Do we feel that it's at this point, a decent estimate for player value? Or are we just saying, you know what, let's go with a more granular analysis and let's not worry too much about it? And again, anybody could jump in.
I mean, I think Fangraphs war is perfect. No, I mean, I think there's no question. It's a flawed metric composed of a whole bunch of things that are valued differently, put together into one big soup can, and we're trying to do the best we can. There's no question it's imperfect, right? Like, if we say a guy's a 6.3 win player, we really mean he's like somewhere between 5.5 and 7, and anywhere in there is probably justifiable. So I think, there's no question. We know it's not exactly 100% correct. We think it's probably better than you just adding up batting average and home runs and RBIs and dividing by 3, which is what people do sometimes, or come up with OPSBI, or I think this is an improvement over what people can do on their own. And so to give it a systematic, objective, this is kind of the way things are weighted for everybody, I think it's an improvement. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. We're working on it. We're trying. If you want to help us improve it, we're open. I think at Fangraphs, our goal is always to have the best information available possible. So,
do teams look at WAR or the equivalent at all, or is it just we've got our scouting information, we've got our statistical information? You obviously have more complex tools at your disposal.
Yeah, no,
okay.
Clubs do look at it. I think WAR and like we have a I guess I'd call it proprietary way of trying to do the same thing, and I think other clubs do, but it's it's a generally accepted metric and with all of its flaws, but I think it reflects what we were talking about before in the context of framing, and that is, every player is a net of his strengths and weaknesses, and you're constantly looking for a way to conclude that with one number, so you don't have to make that same calculation over and over again, player by player. You need something that's sort of a uniform measure. So while it's flawed, definitely clubs are aware of it. And number two, it reflects a real need on the part of people to be able to figure out what this player is in his totality, pluses and minuses. And
Tom Tango always draws the distinction between the framework of WAR and the implementation of WAR, right? So the basic idea, the structure of, you've got your batting runs and your replacement level and your positional adjustment, that seems to make sense. But the implementation of each of those components could possibly be improved. We could find ways to make each of those individual parts of it more accurate, and then the whole will be more accurate. But the basic framework seems like a good approach to the problem.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the panel.
Okay.